This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and I'm currently in the midst of a course at Harvard on the history and development of the Constitution. And I've had the opportunity in this course to dig deep into primary sources and histories and philosophical writings of the Founding Fathers and even European philosophers who influenced the Founding Fathers, and then get into the study of early American history around the time of the Revolution and the ratification of the Constitution. And I've been surprised by the parallels that exist between the situation surrounding America's independence from England and similar controversies in the Catholic Church, where we could set the Pope up as sort of the monarch and the Christians as the Americans, and see different groups among those Christians and use what I think is a clearer set of events in the American Revolution to understand what's really going on in controversies in the Catholic Church. And I'd like to share some of the information from American history studies that I've been working through, and then talk about how I think it sheds light on what's going on in Catholic circles. Now, when we go back into early American history, most of you, like me, were probably raised in modern American schools that teach a certain view of early America. You probably learned things like the Pilgrims came to America from Europe, and they settled and they developed these American colonies, and then the British mistreated them and taxed them unjustly, and the Americans were pushed to a point where they had to revolt in order to defend their rights, and they declared independence, and then they established a constitution and lived happily ever after. That's the normal American school history of the founding of America. But when you dig into the details, it's much more complicated than that. There's a lot more going on when we zoom out, as it were, and see all that's going on in the world at the time, and even on the North American continent at the time. The story becomes much more complicated, and the cause of the Americans becomes much more suspicious. For example, let me just present two points that I think throw a monkey wrench into the common school history of America. First of all, when we talk about taxes in the colonies, and how the King of England was imposing taxes, like taxes on stamps with the Stamp Act, and taxes on tea before the Boston Tea Party, and so on. We're presented with this idea that there's a king living in luxury who simply wants to use the American people as a source of enriching himself. And the means by which he does this is through arbitrary taxation. He just makes up taxes and cripples the American people with all of these taxes that are then gathered and sent back to the royal palace, where he lives, and does whatever he pleases with the tax money. That's sort of the way that British taxes are presented in the modern school history of early America. What they don't tell you was why the king was seeking to collect taxes. The reason why was because he was funding the wars that were protecting the borders of the colonies. The British troops were the ones defending the colonies from other sources of trouble, and he was using taxation to recover some of the expenses of those wars. when you learn that, it puts the whole question of taxation in a very different light. The king was asking the Americans to pay taxes to help cover the costs of their own defense, which was being carried out by the British Army and Navy to some degree. So when you learn that, you realize, okay, so this isn't so cut and dry. The taxes are not necessarily unjust or oppressive. They're necessary because of the cost of self-defense for the colonies, and the king is the one actually covering these costs at the time. He's simply seeking to recover a portion of those expenses through taxation. Okay, so that's one monkey wrench that's thrown into the common school history. But there's more. When we learn the school history of early America, we often learn about the Boston Massacre. And we have this image that was published at the time, which was incendiary and provocative, which shows a bunch of British soldiers firing on a crowd of American colonists, and it's labeled the Boston Massacre. And we learn about that. We learn that these violent, oppressive, abusive British soldiers would just randomly kill Americans as if they were wild animals. Well, there's more to that story, which again throws a monkey wrench into the American school history. After that event, which was called by the colonists the Boston Massacre, after that event, the commander of those soldiers, who I think his name was Thomas Preston, was brought on trial and charged with murder. The soldiers also were brought to trial and charged with murder. They were represented in court by the American founding father, John Adams. John Adams represented the commander and the soldiers in court, and the commander and soldiers were declared not guilty of murder by the court. They were acquitted, and the killing was justified in the court as an act of self-defense. So there was no such thing as a Boston Massacre where a bunch of abusive, bullying British soldiers opened fire on a bunch of innocent American colonists. And the person who made that argument was John Adams, the second president of the United States. So that throws another monkey wrench into the early American history. And there's more. Another common lesson in American history classes is that America was oppressed by the British, and they were getting tired of being pushed around by the British. They were tired of having their rights denied, so the Founding Fathers, led by Thomas Jefferson, sat down and wrote the Declaration of Independence and said, we're not going to take this anymore. We refuse to be bullied. We declare ourselves independent. And that this would have shocked the British, and then the Revolutionary War ensued. The Declaration of Independence is presented to American school students as sort of the declaration of rebellion and independence against the British king. Well, when we learn more about the history, we learn that the Declaration of Independence was published in 1776. Well, in 1775, the year before, in December of 1775, the King of England, or I should say Parliament, issued what was called the Prohibitory Act. This was 1775, where the British government cut off America and punished America for disorderliness that was going on, the British government imposed punishments upon the American colonists. They forbid Americans to trade with other nations. And they made it possible for American ships to seize and take possession of American ships at sea. The king also swore that he would no longer protect the American colonies. This was called the Prohibitory Act and was published in 1775. At the time, John Adams actually explained that he felt, in light of what was going on in America, that this was a great gift because the King of England declared independence for us. So the separation between England and America was already being established by the king as a means of punishment. The American colonists sent delegates to Philadelphia to discuss what to do, and there were two sides at the Continental Congress. There were some, called Tories, who believed that the Americans should work to be reconciled, to submit to the king, to fix the problems that they were accused of by the king, and be reconciled. There were people arguing for reconciliation. And there were other people, called Whigs, who were fighting for who were arguing for the need to formally declare independence. And remember, these men believed that the colonies were already being forced to live independently. It was just a matter of formally declaring themselves independent, committing to independence, and not seeking to be reconciled to England. So the Prohibitory Act had two possible outcomes in America. It could be seen as a means of correction to which the Americans responded by making amends and getting themselves back in line with the king, or it could be seen as a declaration of independence, which the Americans would confirm their intentions to proceed with and declare their own independence. But the idea of independence was already being established by the King of England himself. So when the Americans published the Declaration of Independence, they were simply responding to the Prohibitory Act and making it official. Not that they chose to rebel against the King of England, but that a situation was already in place where they were already living in independence and they were simply seeking to formalize and declare that independence official. And so then in response to that, the Revolutionary War was fought, whereby the British made one final effort to bring the colonists back into order, and the colonists chose to commit to independence. So when you get into the study of the history, it becomes much more complicated. There's pros and cons on both sides, and we find that what was most amazing about the American Founding Fathers, and I'll focus specifically on John Adams because he's been one character that I've been studying most peculiarly, and I've become a very great admirer of John Adams, though I wouldn't recommend the popular movie series, the television series that was made. I would recommend you actually read the biographies. The biography by David McCullough on John Adams. Really amazing story of a very, very special man, John Adams. What we see is that in America at that time, there were actually a number of different groups. And this is what's difficult to draw out of the history, especially when you're given an overly simplified school history. The school histories present us with a false dilemma. There were patriots on one side in America, and then there were, you know, British on the other side. There were colonists or patriots and the redcoats, and we're presented with this us against them image of the War of Independence. That's really not how things were. There were multiple groups. Let's say that there were three important groups. There were the loyalists who just wanted to submit to the king and have America be an English set of colonies, or even an English nation. If there was independence, they wanted to maintain some kind of brotherhood with England. They were the loyalists. There was an opposing group, which was sort of the mob of people in the streets that wanted to kill British soldiers and revolt against the king. That was a second group. That was the second group, this population of common people who just wanted to rebel and wanted to kill and fight and overthrow and refuse to pay taxes and all this kind of stuff. But the third group was the moderate group that was trying to avoid the evils of both extremes and do what was best. And this is where we find the Founding Fathers, and most peculiarly, I would say, John Adams. John Adams was a lawyer. Remember, he was the one who represented the British soldiers who were accused of massacring American colonists. John Adams was a just and honest and careful man in America. He was a lawyer. He believed that the country should be ruled by laws. He was a promoter of very, very strict justice, in the sense that justice should be guaranteed to all people. John Adams hated the angry American revolutionary mob. John Adams fought against the revolutionary mob because he knew that it was evil and sinful. He did not support the mob. At the same time, John Adams believed that independence was necessary. And so John Adams and other men with him, like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and the other members of that Continental Congress, they debated and talked and worked together to establish the very fine line of American independence. They carefully crafted every document. They discussed every single word, every sentence, every line of the documents. And they sought to explain why independence was a matter of necessity and not just a whim of the people to rebel against authority. And in the founding documents of the American nation, they articulated all of these things very carefully. That's what we see in the Declaration of Independence, a very careful, reasonable, respectful explanation of the need for formal independence in America, very carefully composed and revised by Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. And then as we get into the first government, the Confederation of the Colonies, established by the Articles of Confederation, we see this very, very serious concern for the independence of the colonies as separate bodies, and then the Constitution, which seeks to establish some centralized government for necessary purposes, while also retaining the independence of the states. So we see very careful reasoning, deliberating, arguing, revising work done by the Founding Fathers in the midst of these opposite extremes. The English didn't want to lose the American colonies, but they had to realize that they really had no just claim on what was developing in America. And then you had the wild rebels who just wanted to have an excuse to kill and burn and destroy. The Founding Fathers had to moderate this powder keg that was about to explode, and they did so through the meetings of the Congress, which had several meetings, and finally, as I said, declared independence, made it formal, and then had to face a Revolutionary War, which was led by George Washington, who was a member of the Congress, who was directed by and accountable to the Congress. It wasn't this wild bunch of armed bandits running through the woods killing British soldiers. It was much more thoughtful and principled and orderly than all that. So that's a more realistic picture of the founding of America and how early America developed. It's also important to note that in early 1776, Thomas Paine wrote a treatise called Common Sense, in which he explained all of the reasons why America should declare independence. It was a very, very popular tract that was published and spread through the American colonies. And it, as I said, laid out all of the reasons for independence, why the American people should seek independence. Now, when that tract got into the hands of the common people, it obviously inflamed them. And this was a problem. The founding fathers didn't want the people inflamed. They didn't want some stupid rebellion because there was no plan for what America would do afterwards. After they won a war of independence, there was no plan for what America would do, how America would actually create something better. And so in response to Thomas Paine's Common Sense, John Adams wrote another document that was titled Thoughts on Government, which was published in 1776, after Thomas Paine's Common Sense and before the publishing of the Declaration of Independence, I think. But Adams wrote Thoughts on Government, in which he sort of cooled down and pumped the brakes on all of this independence talk, because independence is one thing. Establishing a new government in the absence or the vacuum created by the Revolutionary War was something America was completely unprepared for. And so John Adams laid out the basic principles that would eventually influence the Constitution. But it was much more complicated than the sort of lazy, normal school textbook likes to make it seem. Many people living in America believe in that misrepresentation of the founding of America and think it's virtuous to act like the angry mob that wanted to revolt, to think that the Boston Tea Party was a good idea. The leaders at the time were not supporting things like the Boston Tea Party. They didn't want to incite a war with England. They didn't even have time yet to discuss what the colonies would do. The danger was that those who were pushing independence were just reckless and careless and were going to lead to a situation that would likely be much worse than what already existed. And so the founding fathers were constantly trying to calm the people while they took their time to work out the solutions that needed to be established for America to move from an ineffective arrangement to a more perfect arrangement in the colonies. Now, as I said at the beginning of this, I see many parallels between what was going on in early America and what we see in the Catholic Church today. I see the Pope, and I would compare him to the King of England. He's the supreme authority in the church, and he sits as something of a monarch of the Catholic Church. And then in the Catholic Church, there are a number of different groups. There are strict loyalists who will simply give honor to anything that the Pope says and want nothing but to follow the Pope's directions. They're sort of the loyalists in comparison with the American colonists. Then on the other hand, you've got the wild rebels, the street rabble that are just eager for rebellion. And I would put in that group the Protestants, and I would also put in that group Catholics who just recklessly and easily speak against the Pope every day. They're like they're like that wild mob in the streets, provoking fights, just speaking slanderously and disrespectfully towards the king, who at the time remained their lawful king. So I would take all of those who speak against the Pope as Protestants and Catholics who do so disrespectfully, recklessly, with no plan for what would be done, practically, other than just destroy everything. I would put them on the side of the wild revolutionaries, and then I would consider a middle ground where I believe Catholics should be, where they're considering all the details and trying to make calm, clear-headed, reasonable decisions in light of these controversies. Now, I will grant the argument that trad Catholics make, that it seems that the Pope does things that are almost intentionally provocative. I really have a difficult time watching the hierarchy of the church embrace groups like the LGBTQ crowd and then attack those who identify as traditional Catholics. I understand that appears to be very bad. That's a very bad look in the Catholic Church, to pretend that this group is closer to the truth than this group seems a bit ridiculous. And I can admit that. I can admit that when I consider the position of what I would consider reasonable, tradition-loving Catholics, it seems that to pick on the traditional Catholics, to restrict them, to beat them up, to criticize them publicly, and so on, while making every effort, it seems, to befriend other groups, liberal politicians, and so on. I can understand, and I will grant, that that's a bad look that appears hard to justify. It's provocative. It's similar to some of the things that the King of England did to the colonists, which seemed just to be provocative and annoying, like the tea tax. The tea tax, what happened there, if you don't know the story, is that England forbid the colonies to trade with anyone except England. They would then send products to the American port at Boston, in that case. They would send shiploads of products that the Americans didn't ask for. They would require that the Americans accept the shipments and charge them taxes for those shipments. So the Americans got full ships of cargo that they didn't ask for. They were forbidden to trade with anyone else, and they were forced to pay the tax on the products on the ship as if they had ordered and purchased it themselves, and they didn't do so. And the Americans were refusing to accept these imports that they didn't ask for and pay taxes on them as if they had chosen to That's what happened at the Boston Tea Party. It wasn't just a rejection of taxes for something purchased. It was more complicated and more provocative than that. So the way that the King of England did things that seemed to provoke the Americans, almost do things that could not have any effect on the people other than stir them up even more and confirm their suspicions. It does seem sometimes that leaders in the church do that to traditional Catholics. I'll grant that. However, rebellion is still an irrational option and one for which no alternative that's better can be provided. Look at the Protestants. They chose to rebel, and again, they were part of that whole time period and spirit of the age. They chose to rebel against the Catholic Church with nothing in place that would solve the problems or provide any kind of solution, and it's just led to an embarrassment of Christianity with factions and sects and divisions all over the place that never stop, the craziest wackiness being made possible, and so on. They took a bad situation, which even the church acknowledged was a bad situation, and they produced an even worse situation. That's what the Protestants did. That's what the American mob would have done had the sober and just-minded founding fathers not prevented them from doing so. And what I think we see today on the loyalist side in Catholic circles is, and I admit that I, as an individual, tend to favor the loyalist side because I don't trust myself. There's one saying that Ben Franklin made at one of I think it was the Constitutional Congress, where he said, doubt your infallibility. He said that to his fellow delegates as they considered the Constitution. He said, doubt your infallibility. And that's a statement that I think is really important. I doubt my infallibility. I am always going to be inclined to submit to church authority because I doubt my own understanding, I doubt my knowledge, I doubt my experience, and I trust that men who are older and more experienced than me may always be right, and therefore I will very reluctantly disagree with anyone in the hierarchy of the church. The magisterium, after all, lies with the Pope and bishops in union with him. There's no maverick religion in Catholicism. And the Catholic Church moves slowly, and sometimes we're just frustrated because we want to move in a certain direction at a certain speed, and the church moves at its own speed, and we sort of get out of rhythm with the church, and we feel like there's a conflict where really it's just an individual moving quickly and being frustrated by a church that is not going to move so quickly. I think that's usually what the problems are, and it requires humility and patience to just stay in your lane and trust that if there is a need for the church to adapt in a certain way or do a certain thing, that God is going to lead the church to do that. But I tend to lean towards the loyalist side, but at the same time, working in education, being a parent, living as a layman in the world, I recognize that there is a need for the kind of subtle, careful thinking that the founding fathers of America modeled for us. I see this in education, where I believe that the Catholic schools are fundamentally flawed. At the same time, I respect them and support them because the church manages to provide education for probably, I don't know the numbers, I would guess hundreds of thousands of students in America. And so I wouldn't want to stupidly attack and pull down that system when there's no better option in place for all of those children. That's one thing the founding fathers would avoid. They wouldn't tear something down for which a better alternative was not first made ready. I don't believe there is a better alternative, and so I believe that Catholics should continue to support Catholic schools until there is. At the same time, I will work to try and solve the problems and create a better alternative. That's what I've devoted myself to. So it is revolutionary in a sense, in that I don't just jump into the Catholic school system and try to work within that. I believe that the problems are fundamental and not just accidental or superficial. I believe that there are real philosophical errors in what the Catholic schools have chosen to do, and I believe that an alternative has to be created first and made successful so that there's an alternative before any attack is made on the schools. So I find a need for Catholics, especially lay Catholics, parents raising children, in a church that really seems to be unable to comprehend the challenges that families and parents currently face. It seems to be very insensitive to the difficulties of Catholic family life today. I feel a need to separate in a moderate way, practically as a layperson, and pursue independent activities. But I don't think the church is against that. I think the church allows that kind of independence and even embraces it eventually. And I'm not sure that the King of England might have embraced an idea of independence that included collaboration and friendship. It was just the roughness of it and the disrespect of the American colonists that sort of necessitated a bloody war. So it was complicated, but the founding fathers, they were not seeking war with England. They were seeking to find the right solution to the problems that existed, which Thomas Paine and John Adams explained in their tracts at the time. And so I think that for Catholics, there's a need for this careful, deliberative, patient, reasonable, moderate position where it's not a blind loyalty that just denies that problems exist, but at the same time, it's a position that has nothing to do with rebellion in any way. And I believe that whereas the American colonists, they really had no guarantee that the British would come around and improve, I think as Catholics, we have 2,000 years of church history that shows that the church always overcomes challenges that arise, and saints rise up and create solutions. They sometimes ruffle feathers, but they always remain in union with the magisterium. And that's why I would reject any schismatic, disobedient group, because they do not respond like saints. They don't separate themselves. They don't contradict or revolt against the Pope as the angry mob did to the king in early America. They remain humble and obedient. They're patient. They take what opportunities are granted them. They don't take more than they're given. And eventually their works become part of the church's works. And we see this in the lives of people like St. Benedict, St. Francis, St. Dominic, and so on. We see works that are by their nature critical, but they're obedient. They're revolutionary, but they're not rebellious. And I think that, I may not articulate that really well, but I think there's a difference between working independently to improve things, which is part of our role as laymen, working independently to improve things, but doing so in a way that's balanced and remains in union with the hierarchy of the church. And so it's this careful, cautious, informed, reasonable reaction to current events that I think Catholics really have to be careful to keep in mind. And we have a good example to follow in the leading founders of the American government. They provide us with a model of this. They were not wild revolutionaries. Patrick Henry was not there, writing the Constitution. Patrick Henry I don't believe he was at the Continental Congress. That fiery rhetoric, that was among the people. Even men like Thomas Paine just stirring up the call for independence. That was not the spirit of the men at the Congresses, the delegates who actually were involved in forming the American government. They were much more reasonable men who, to be honest, leaned towards loyalism. So I think there's a lot for us to learn from the Founding Fathers. I encourage you to study it. I encourage you to study it and see how the modern dilemmas in the Catholic life parallel the dilemmas that the early Americans faced, how the angry, foolish mob responded, and how that compares to how many today are responding. You know, when you see people like Taylor Marshall or these other clowns just stirring up anger, just provoking more and more anger and frustration, amplifying every provocative event that takes place, and they just stir up and stir. What's the end game? What's the end plan? After all of these people are stirred up to anger, stirred up to rebellion, stirred up to disobedience, what's the end game? Schism? What's the plan? This was the problem in early America. The people stirring up the mob, just reciting all of the provocations in their hearing every day and stirring up the anger. They had no end game. They had no plan for what would be done, and they would have destroyed America. The Founding Fathers fought against those men. When we look at the saints through history, we find revolutionaries among the saints. But they never did the stuff that these provocative, clickbait, social media commentators and self-publishing writers are doing. The saints never did these things. The saints pursued revolutionary works for sure. They revolutionized different aspects of church life. There was nothing like St. Francis. There was nothing like St. Dominic. There was nothing like St. Benedict. There was nothing like John Bosco. There was nothing like Padre Pio. We see these examples of the saints and how there's this constant reformation, this constant renewal in the church through the saints. But there is never a separation from the hierarchy of the church. There's never a disrespectful word. There's never provocative, rabble-rousing talk among the saints. There's none of that rebellious spirit that almost got the American colonists annihilated. There's none of that among the wise and principled founding fathers. There's none of that among the saints in church history. And I think we need to look, for a good illustration as Americans, we need to look at the founding fathers, how careful they were, and realize in their situation, independence was necessary, because we're talking about secular governments. But in the church, there will never be any separation. There will be a constant development of the church, which will address these problems, and as we'll see, looks to Catholic people to form solutions, often independently, to form solutions that prove themselves over time, prove themselves to be capable of lasting, prove themselves independently, and eventually are embraced and received into the church as approved institutions or approved movements. And so we see this all through church history. It goes back to the idea in the book of Acts where the apostles were causing commotion because they were presenting something new. And the Pharisees wanted to just snuff them out. Foolish people were looking for, zealots were looking for any excuse to rebel against the religious leaders. But that's not what the apostles were doing. The apostles were bringing the Jewish religion to its perfection. And that would be seen over time in what the wisdom of Gamaliel in the book of Acts shows us, is that what he counsels the Pharisees is that they should not try to stomp out or snuff out the apostles, but simply see what happens and see if the work that the apostles do is lasting work. Because if God is with them, it will persevere and it will be proven to be divinely inspired activity that lasts and overcomes all obstacles. And therefore Gamaliel counseled the Jewish leaders to simply watch and see what happens, because if it's false, it won't last. It'll die. And that's what the Jews did, and obviously the results speak for themselves. So I just want to throw this out to you. If you want to think about this issue soberly, if you're not the kind of person who's already made up his mind and is just looking for an excuse to rebel, that's not the kind of person I'm talking. I'm talking about the person who is gathering the information, understands the authority of the church, may feel frustrated and provoked, but is reasonable still, and wants to think carefully through these issues and avoid sin. I think you should look to the founding fathers, men like John Adams and George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and see what they did in the face of troubles with respect to a lawful authority. I recommend, there's a series I mentioned before, just to get started, a series that was done on John Adams by HBO. You can find it on something like Amazon Prime. It's a good place to start, but more than that, if you've got the time, I'd recommend reading the biography of John Adams by David McCullough, which you can get on Audible and just listen to. But I would recommend something like that, or getting a hand on these documents like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, John Adams's Thoughts on Government. There's another book by a woman named Pauline Maier titled Ratification, the Debate Concerning the Constitution, which I also recommend. But study the history in detail of early American founding and see the prudence and carefulness and complexity of the situation and how it was handled by the founding fathers, and then consider how that prudence and carefulness and patience needs to be applied to Catholic controversies, which have a different nature than those of the American political controversies. And I think you'll find help finding a balanced position that keeps you in union with the church, but at the same time working independently to do the work of a reformer. I hope that's helpful. God bless.